I've had a video going viral for about 2 weeks on TikTok about borderline personality disorder. Now, I do not have a formal diagnosis of this, but I'm old. When I read the Mayo Clinic definition, it's definitely something that I would be diagnosed with should somebody want to diagnose me. That is the story. But when I'm reading the diagnosis, what the kind of quote symptoms are, what I'm reading is a description of an incredibly psychologically abused child struggling to come to terms with finding their authentic self, who's existed in a family system that's been dangerous to them. So I want to talk a little bit about what it's like from the experiential side of borderline personality disorder. It seems to me that the only people who experience something that we want to hear from are narcissists, and they're the actual people that we don't need to hear from because they can't actually tell the truth. So, what we really need to start doing is, other than narcissists, going to the source. So with borderline personality, I mean, the way I see it is it's inversely related to kind of disordered parents, right? That there's a form of parent, narcissistic, sociopath, psychopaths, disordered parents, limited parents, people that cannot make connections to other human beings having children and engage what I call parental masking, which is to say, facing forward, everything looks fine. Everything is perfect. The house is good. The cars are good. The kids have nice clothes. Everything looks good. It's a prop, it's like a little Norman Rockwell picture. But beneath the surface, you have disordered parents incapable of recognizing needs, right? So the child's needs don't actually exist within the family system. The only needs that the child gets addressed are the ones that everyone else can see, which is why the clothes thing, it's really disgusting. But what it does is leaves an empty child. And then as the empty child's kind of problems begin because of this lack of actual parenting, the child starts to kind of get in trouble because they're falling behind. So that's one thing. This no authentic self-recognition is another thing. I like to say, parenting, you're like a moon when a child's born, and they're the sun. And your job as a successful parent is to kind of slowly move away so that the son or daughter's sun can shine forth. Well, a disordered parent never moves. They can't recognize anyone's needs. They don't know why anybody else would need to shine. They think their light is good enough for everyone. They see their children as like smaller, diminished versions of their light. So what difference does it make anyways? They can't do anything. So the child is parented by an incredibly unstable person. I mean, a narcissist at root is unstable. We don't see that because we only see them in triangulated relationships where they appear confident. But if you were to see the sum total of all their relationships, they're unstable. They're not showing the same thing to the same person really ever. Now, when a child is a captive audience, that means the child's seeing a different parent every time they talk to him. How's a child supposed to establish a kind of stable, authentic sense of self? They're not. So when they go out in the world, they're actually clinging to find an identity and clinging to find a sense of self in ways that other children aren't. Other children are using their identities as armor out in the world to kind of learn how to communicate with other people, learn to exist in the world, something that's not being taught along with everything else, right? So what you see is all of these kind of self-survival mechanisms and defense mechanisms for the children suffering with so-called BPD, because they're in a system, they're in a family system that's dangerous, and they don't really understand why. It's conditioning them to be abrasive. It's conditioning them to not get along with people because they have a narcissist, and narcissists can't get along with anyone. So it's all about their relationship templates, and then subsequently their defense mechanisms, because their relationship templates are off. When they go out into the world, they're not interpreted properly, and they're interpreted as hostile. So then their defense mechanisms double down and become more hostile, and it becomes this self-sustaining loop of hostility where all they're trying to do is seek connection, because that's their primary aim in life. Because again, a narcissist can't connect with people. So the child's entire life is organized around finding connection with people who cannot connect to them. And the forward-facing anger frustration is the frustration at having no connections. And then when we actually experience connection, it's traumatic. We don't know what to do with it, and we end up ruining it and running away. Now, people can experience that as abuse, sure, but I'm trying to get to the experience so that we might not have the interpersonal problems. So, again, at the bottom of all of this, as far as the experience and what the abuse is a full emotional and intellectual repression. We know about narcissistic emotional regulation. In a family, it's total. You're not allowed to have your own emotions. So, when the kind of moon metaphor is blocking the sun, the emotions are the stuff trying to get around the parent, right? So the emotions are all the attempts to kind of get the parent to act, to get other people to act, to get out from under there, to be seen, to let people know what's going on. Maybe if I'm hysterical, they'll understand me. If I'm abrasive, nobody's listening, it's lying. It becomes this kind of frantic thing. But the intellectual repression is a little harder. I mean, it's kind of like the easiest way to understand it is like Donald Trump and the way narcissists, like, you can't just speak directly to them. Like when he's being interviewed, there's no real direct talk about what's going on. Nobody in his family can go and tell him to kind of stop trying to retake over the country. And anybody in a narcissistic family will know what I'm talking about. That there's just the direct problems, the actual reality of the problems are never directly discussed. And this isn't like talked about. It's just a matter of the conditioning in the family. And that's why when I see all these comments, well, my parents weren't narcissists. I had great parents. They did the best they can. Whenever I hear somebody with BPD saying the parents did the best they can and they really did love me, what I hear is the parental conditioning. Because that's exactly what the conditioning of narcissistic parents says. I did the best I could. That verbatim, I did the best I could. They didn't. They did not do the best they could. I'd like to see the receipts on that. I'd like to see a third party review this story and really get into it. Maybe they did, but I highly doubt it. I don't believe BPD is a personality disorder, and I certainly don't believe it comes from nowhere. The way it reads is, it's like a severely psychologically abused person in their family system, or perhaps another system. I mean, I do think it's got to be like some sort of crucial relationship, but I think BPD is kind of a spectrum. And it's about interpersonal relationships and properly expressing your emotions and broken emotional responses. So all of those exist on a conditioned mind level, which means that they can be unconditioned, that they're not really a personality disorder. Like narcissistic personality disorder is all in the subconscious. That is why it's such a problem. They're communicating their abuse from the subconscious in what's not being said. Borderline is usually about dealing with someone like that, who's dealing in the conscious mind really forcefully, abrasively, and what they interpret as abusively, but is usually speaking the truth to somebody that doesn't or isn't capable of hearing the truth about themselves. So we talk about, narcissists dating BPD, but then we don't want to correlate all these people complaining about BPD as narcissists. But I think the question has to be asked. They go hand in hand. Everybody with BPD is copying that they date narcissists. Why aren't everybody with narcissists copying that they date BPD? Everybody that dates somebody with BPD magically isn't talking about their own behavior. Doesn't seem narcissistic at all. So, all of these behavioral issues are interpersonal, which means they're products of interpersonal behaviors, language essentially, and how we treat one another. So, I think it's time to really start getting into the experience of these things. And the narcissist could help us. I mean, there are famous narcissists that could begin talking about their trauma instead of role-playing and flirting with girls. I mean, that's one thing. They could actually do some shadow work on themselves and actually heal, not just run business plans and scams. So, it gets into like, are we seriously into psychology, or are we into like online cults and like Maury Povich, Jerry Springer type shit like mental illness? That's all that is. It's the glorified Jerry Springer show. I like healing. I like talking about real issues of consciousness. And, narcissistic personality disorder, borderline, all of these things speak to the way we affect one another in ways we don't know. Because it's curious to me that everybody says narcissistic abuse is so hard to spot, and then they have all of these self-aware narcissists just telling us observe behavior, which we all know as though we didn't see that. What they do over there is, it's not that it's hard to spot. What they're doing is they're selling absolution. By correlating the domestic violence with the narcissist, they're telling their clients and their customers that they weren't at fault for staying in the relationship. That they didn't choose the relationship. The narcissist is like a magical spellcaster who love bombed them and forced them to stay in the relationship. When there's domestic violence involved, it's an incredibly difficult situation, and I am not speaking about that. Domestic violence and narcissistic abuse aren't the same thing. So, it's really a matter of just keeping the silos separate, making sure all advocacy groups get seen and heard, and that we don't have abusers heading up victim communities abusing. It's really just that simple. So I'm going to start this with BPD by showing what self-awareness looks like from a sufferer of something. And it's not preying on my victims. It's weird. No BPD victims want to know about anything about BPD abusers. They just want them to change, but they want to know all about Lee Hammock, even though he hasn't changed. They just don't understand what a narcissist is.